0542 local time. A high-value Russian armored convoy started pushing down a slick, muddy track in eastern Ukraine. Torrential rain was coming down hard, looking like perfect aerial cover from overhead strike assets. Tactically speaking, the Russian commander's call to keep pushing this entire armored element forward probably felt bold, calculated, and totally secure. But in this combat zone, the illusion of safety is always the very first casualty. Critical tactical errors rarely show up at the starting line. These blunders only reveal themselves when heavy armor is fully committed, and it is far too late to abort mission. What happened next exposed a brutal reality. The heavier and more arrogant an assault formation gets about its own firepower, the faster it can slide right into a lethal trap with absolutely zero exit strategy. So, let's break down the intel. What exactly triggered a massive Russian armored thrust, one holding absolute tactical initiative to collapse? How did they stumble into the kill zone so fast? Stay locked on military force for the sitrep. The column's first major threat was not hostile fire. It was the fatal assumption that terrible weather would mask their advance completely. We tracked 22 pieces of heavy Russian armor grinding down a tight dirt route in the eastern sector. Torrential rain had churned the terrain into deep mud. To the Russian frontline commanders, this looked like the perfect weather window to push. Zero visibility usually grounds enemy aerial reconnaissance. Severe storms also neutralize small tactical drones along the front line. Historically, combat units use driving rain, heavy fog, and low ceilings to cloak major troop deployments. For a heavy mechanized unit, that natural stealth feels incredibly valuable when navigating totally exposed kill zones. It generates a false sense of security, tricking troops into thinking the battlefield is temporarily safe. That exact illusion pushes battlefield commanders into greenlighting incredibly high-risk combat operations. This happens constantly when raw speed and massive armor formations are their primary offensive tactics. But looking at the tactical map, this storm altered more than just visibility. It physically compressed the Russian convoy into an extremely vulnerable posture. Rain blocked the eyes in the sky, sure, but it also completely killed Russian ground mobility. The operational hazard escalated significantly, with every single meter those tanks dragged through the sludge. The treacherous mud did not just slow the column, it tightly stacked it up. Multi-ton combat assets could not veer off-road. Attempting that guaranteed severe delays, broken tracks, or total mission-killing immobilization. Consequently, the entire armored battalion was bottlenecked into a single file down one highly restricted corridor. Every single driver was handcuffed to the exact speed of the tank ahead. That predictable pacing stripped the entire formation of its tactical flexibility on the battlefield. A vanguard designed to dominate through armored shock tactics was officially trapped inside a fatal geographical choke point. That is exactly how the weather weaponized itself against them. The heavy downpour did not shield those Russian assets for long. It restricted Russian maneuverability, while completely preserving their false sense of safety. The moment that armored column stretched down the mud track, its movement profile became highly predictable. Before a single shot was fired, this Russian element was bleeding out the most critical armor advantage: rapid maneuverability. Evasive maneuvers were physically impossible long before the first explosive payload ever dropped. In modern warfare, lethal threats do not just rely on visual drone identification. It also comes down to whether an advancing force locks itself into a highly predictable tactical vector. The armored spearhead looked lethal on paper, but it was funneled directly into a death trap. Russian command genuinely believed the fierce storm was shielding them. You and I have to ask, did Ukrainian commanders just sit back, waiting until this exact convoy literally ran out of maneuver space? Ukrainian Tactical Command made a brilliant call. They refused to engage the armor the second it appeared. They held fire, waiting until the storm broke just enough to launch FPV drone swarms with absolute lethal precision. That operational choice mattered because the Russian armor was bogged down, strung out along a tight dirt path, completely paralyzed by the very weather they thought provided cover. Severe downpours grounded aerial assets temporarily, but Ukrainian defense forces never viewed this weather as a permanent operational barrier. They tracked the weather system as a tactical variable. The minute the rain broke and cloud cover lifted slightly, the entire battle space instantly transformed. That Russian column was still hopelessly gridlocked in single file, but the skies above them were suddenly wide open for incoming drone strikes. That handed Ukrainian operators something far more lethal than surprise. It gave them absolute operational timing. Right now, you and I are watching modern drone warfare at its most brutal. The side picking the exact launch second dictates the entire opening clash. Firing early ruins your range and wastes maximum impact. Wait too long, and your target scatters. They shift formation or scramble into heavy cover before you strike. Ukrainian forces just nailed that deadly middle ground. This armored column pushed far enough to get tightly boxed in, trapped right inside a narrow road geometry that left them entirely exposed. Listen to this, because this ambush was never just about speed. It was built on pure, cold patience. Ukrainian operators completely stopped reacting to where the Russian armor moved. They forced the enemy armor straight into a predetermined kill zone. On a battlefield dominated by FPV strikes, exact timing beats raw firepower. It completely decides who controls the fight and who bleeds from absolute panic right from the opening bell. Ukrainian strike teams waited until that column committed to the asphalt, locked into the foul weather, and locked into a marching rhythm that was getting dangerously predictable to watch. This launch sequence displayed a tactical discipline that goes way past just throwing random attack drones up into the sky. Multiple FPV squads pulled the trigger almost simultaneously, but they did not jam into the same airspace. These pilots split their drones hard across totally separate altitude bands. They attacked from stacked vertical levels, making sure they hammered that Russian convoy at the exact same split second. That brilliant tactic stopped friendly drones from crashing into each other blindly. It also made this incoming assault an absolute nightmare to defend. Instead of tracking threats on one flat horizon, those Russian gunners took intense fire from multiple heights simultaneously. This heavily escalated the strike. We are not just talking about a basic swarm flying into the front of the line. It became a stacked combat profile. It magnified the kill radius and completely shredded the enemy's reaction time. We need to categorize this opening wave as a true, brutal saturation attack. The mission was never just crippling the lead tank and letting the rest of the column adjust. The goal was throwing the entire convoy into pure panic simultaneously. True saturation is about way more than just raw numbers. It was about forcing too many life or death choices in seconds. A heavy armored column stuck in deep mud already has zero tactical freedom on the ground. Once suicide drones start dropping from 3 different altitudes, that nightmare gets much worse. Desperate crews have to instantly guess the primary threat, which axis to shoot at, and fire before the next explosive charge hits them. And that is exactly how Ukrainian forces weaponized a simple weather break into extreme offensive power. From then on, this operation was no longer just a few drones harassing heavy Russian metal. It turned into a bloody race between Ukrainian attack velocity and Russia's frantic struggle to block pressure hitting them everywhere at once. But the Russians did not just sit there waiting to die. As those Ukrainian systems went hot, Russian electronic warfare units inside that column quickly picked up a massive spike in radio frequencies. That data is crucial because drone control signals completely expose an attack's blueprint before any warheads actually strike the vehicles. For the Russian defenders, this opened a tight, desperate window to hit back before the ambush fully detonated. Let's analyze this tactically together. In this exact fight, hunting the drone operators matters just as much as destroying the drones. The defenders are not just spraying bullets at the sky. They are actively trying to vaporize the launch pad, the command site, or the critical signal source driving the entire assault. Russian commanders clearly grasped that fast, turning early radar detection into the first link of a massive counterstrike chain. Once that suspected pilot zone was pinpointed, those coordinates got instantly relayed to heavy artillery positioned far behind the lines. This aggressively flipped basic signal monitoring into lethal counter-battery fire in minutes. It proved this Russian convoy actually retained a working defensive grid despite the chaos. These troops were not just sitting ducks soaking up damage. They actively tried to smash the assault at its root before hell rained down right over that muddy road. That battlefield logic makes total sense. An aerial drone strike is never just about flying. It relies entirely on soldiers, exposed antennas, glowing monitors, and vulnerable radio links below. What do you and I learn here? Snap those links fast enough, and even a brilliant strike completely shatters before it draws blood. We are tracking breaking frontline developments. For Russian forces, hammering the drone operator zones with artillery seemed like a much faster fix than shooting down every incoming bird individually. But here is the catch. That doctrine only holds up if the attackers rely on one exposed command node. Ukrainian commanders clearly planned for exactly that incoming threat. When heavy Russian artillery pounded the primary drone operating sites, these tactical teams did not just sit in the kill zone waiting to be wiped out. They displaced rapidly, handing off signal control to secondary command units that kept the airborne swarm perfectly on target. This battlefield adaptation completely flipped the momentum of the engagement. Any strike relying on a single static pilot dies the second that position takes incoming fire. But a decentralized strike network is incredibly tough to shatter. If one transmission node gets leveled, the drone assault stays lethal by seamlessly routing through another. That tactical depth gave Ukrainian forces absolute resilience today. The swarm remained a deadly threat because the invisible human network commanding it survived the barrage. That explains why rapid Russian signal detection ultimately proved completely insufficient. Russian electronic warfare pinpointed the threat, traced it, and unleashed artillery. But the Ukrainian combat protocol was engineered to survive that exact explosive sequence. They distributed battlefield risk across multiple units, hidden locations, and redundant command and control layers. This drastically lowered the odds that a lucky Russian artillery barrage could neutralize the drone wave before it slammed the convoy. The strategic takeaway here is not that Russian electronic warfare proved totally meaningless. It proves that modern warfare heavily rewards drone networks that absorb massive kinetic disruption and just keep hunting. Ukrainian troops were not just fielding cheap explosive airframes. They leveraged a highly adaptable command structure right inside a heavily contested battle space. Down in the trenches, that meant this fight came down to more than just raw hardware. It was about which military force maintained constant operational control while taking heavy fire. Russian forces detected the threat early, but they simply could not halt the relentless drone swarm fast enough. That tactical failure pushed this engagement right into a brutal, highly lethal phase for the mechanized column. Stick with me here, because this is the pivot. The entire clash turned critical when strikes neutralized the lead and rear vehicles of the Russian column simultaneously. That one devastating maneuver instantly doomed every piece of armor caught in between. Before the strike, this was a mobile, heavily armored spearhead. Seconds later, it devolved into a paralyzed string of metal targets jammed onto a tight dirt road. Burning lead tanks meant the formation could absolutely no longer push forward. The shattered rearguard made any organized tactical retreat completely impossible. The panicked troops trapped in the middle were suddenly stripped of all their combat flexibility. They became a static chain of heavy armor facing dropping survival odds and massive battlefield exposure. This matters tactically because armor depends on rapid movement as much as thick steel. A mechanized column survives ambushes only if troops have space to scatter, flank, or punch the gas to retreat. Once that maneuverability vanishes, even top-tier battle tanks become totally useless, metal boxes incredibly fast. Being pinned down inflicted the absolute worst damage directly in the column center. Those crews found themselves trapped on a choked road, totally blocked from pushing the frontline assault forward, and completely unable to throw it in reverse. Swerving off the pavement was tactical suicide, and trying to build fresh defensive lines under intense enemy fire proved physically impossible. The entire Russian offensive bottlenecked into a single narrow kill zone. That road was not projecting military power forward anymore. It was just serving up heavily armored static targets. Tank turrets swiveled, and cannons kept firing back, but returning fire never fixed their fatal mobility crisis. Static firepower only delayed the inevitable frontline slaughter for a brief moment, yet it could not win back tactical spacing or battlefield initiative. The brutal frontline mud made everything worse. Massive combat vehicles do not crawl out of deep trench sludge fast, especially while taking severe drone strikes blind. Yanking those tank tracks off the pavement meant bogging down instantly, bleeding crucial speed, or getting permanently stranded in the dirt. Tactically, the narrow road itself transformed into a brutal death trap. The armored column was not just walled in by smoking wreckage. It was literally imprisoned by the harsh physical landscape surrounding the fight. Every ticking second spiked the lethal traffic jam. Troops trying to hold the line just made their armor sitting ducks, banking on sheer luck instead of combat strategy. You see why this tactical ambush became so insanely dangerous. The assault was not just cracking steel plates. It weaponized the brutal terrain to lock heavy armor perfectly still. You and I are watching this unfold live. With the front and rear locked, the trapped vehicles instantly turned from combat assets into sitting ducks. The convoy immediately lost its ability to fight and move as a unified combat element. Instead, every single crew inside that kill zone realized they were likely next, watching their escape route completely collapse around them in real time. Combat panic like that spreads through a unit incredibly fast. When armor crews see their column blocked at both ends, unit discipline and control vanish quickly. Coordination shatters. Command orders become impossible to execute. The troops forget about the operational mission and fight purely for their own immediate survival. Inside that meat grinder, a mechanized force that looks terrifying on paper breaks down into isolated squads, just waiting to get hit, totally losing their grip on the battle. But just trapping a convoy is never the final tactical goal. To turn this developing ambush into a catastrophic battlefield slaughter, the assault elements had to ensure every single piece of armor stuck in that kill box would never roll back into active combat. Ukrainian forces were not just trying to stall the advance. They were executing a total annihilation plan so nothing could be salvaged once the smoke cleared. That brutal shift in tactics triggered the next bloody phase of this strike. Now, in modern armored warfare, a tank dead on the highway is not always permanently knocked out of the fight. If enemy engineers tow it out later, they can usually fix the battlefield damage. A combat vehicle that looks completely destroyed today might just show up again in next month's offensive. That is exactly why just paralyzing the armor was useless. Ukrainian units needed catastrophic, permanent destruction that hurts the enemy war machine long after the guns fall silent and the roadway is cleared. Let's review the tactical footage together. The attack drones completely ignored the heavy frontal armor. Instead, Ukrainian operators hunted for the engine bays, turret rings, weak armor gaps, and wide-open hatches. Those strikes were highly calculated. These are specific mechanical vulnerabilities where a tiny explosive payload triggers a massive chain reaction inside the hull. Hitting the engine deck sparks fuel fires, shreds the cooling lines, or totally guts the power system that keeps the steel beast rolling. Slamming a charge into the turret ring locks the rotation mechanism and tears apart the delicate internal systems required to fire the main gun. Dropping a grenade down an open hatch is brutally effective because the shock wave and hot shrapnel rip directly into the crew compartment, turning a slightly damaged transport into a permanently destroyed wreck and a total loss. This aggressive pattern proves Ukrainian forces were wielding drones as surgical strike weapons, not just cheap bombs. The tactical objective was converting a successful highway ambush into a permanent bleeding of enemy resources. A $500 drone did not need to blast through a tank's thickest plating. It just had to slip into the exact right vulnerability. Once flames devour the engine block, once the optics are shattered or the crew cabin is gutted, that combat machine is practically worthless to the enemy. The current mission was way past simply halting the Russian column. The frontline goal was slaughtering every trapped vehicle permanently, crippling future Russian offensives, and absolutely overwhelming their heavy maintenance and supply logistics network. This strategic result ripples far beyond the immediate kill zone. An armored thrust gets wiped out fast, but totally destroying recoverable tanks, wrecks future combat operations, mechanical planning, and overall troop readiness. It forces desperate commanders to waste heavy transport trucks, parts, and highly skilled mechanics on salvage operations that yield zero return. That brutal secondary drain hurts the enemy long after the actual ambush ends. That is a massive operational victory for Ukraine, because a totally gutted tank does more than vanish today. It literally bleeds the enemy's ability to mount the next major assault when their resources and tactical options are crashing. Stick with me here, because inside that burning column, one specific asset held far more strategic value than any standard battle tank. It was projecting an invisible dome of electronic armor over the troops. The second that critical system took a direct hit, the entire complexion of this firefight shifted. The absolute highest priority target burning in that Russian column was not just another troop carrier or tank. It was the dedicated electronic warfare rig hiding right in the middle of the formation. That system was actively jamming radio signals, linking command communications, and defending the entire unit against killer drones attacking from the sky. On the modern battlefield, taking out that truck means shattering the convoy's invisible shield. Listen up. Armor protects the steel, but electronic warfare is what actively shields the entire combat network under heavy fire. It jams incoming drone feeds, strips away enemy air dominance, and buys critical seconds for armor crews already taking massive heat. Once that electronic warfare platform took a hit, this convoy lost more than one vehicle. It instantly lost the tactical spine that allowed the entire mechanized formation to fight together. The second jamming strength drops. The airspace rips wide open for killer drones, while losing that central support hub leaves every tank sluggish, uncoordinated, and wide open to the next brutal wave of incoming strikes. For a convoy already trapped in a kill zone, losing that invisible electronic shield was absolutely devastating. It shattered their tactical options. And out here, options keep armored formations alive. That is exactly why this brutal ambush reveals a massive shift beyond just burning metal on a highway. We are seeing firsthand how expensive armor gets erased in minutes when enemy detection, precision timing, and flawless coordination link up. The headline is not just that cheap drones kill expensive tanks. Cost matters, but that completely misses the real tactical lesson. The deeper battlefield reality is that these low-cost weapons turn highly lethal when they hit at the exact right moment, executed within a strict kill chain against critical targets. In today's combat theater, commanders relying purely on thick armor plate or heavy firepower are finding out those traits simply cannot save them alone. Out here, survival requires far more than steel. It requires rapid dispersion, locking down electronic warfare feeds, and returning fire while taking heavy aerial punishment from above. The second that support network crumbles, even the heaviest battle tanks bleed combat effectiveness almost instantly. So this convoy was not just destroyed. An entire doctrine of modern warfare was shattered. What failed here was not just hardware. It was the stubborn idea that mass, cost, and raw protection can dominate a front line where concealment is gone and reaction time drops to literal seconds. This intense ambush proved modern armored warfare is not just about heavy steel, raw firepower, or the sheer size of your column. It runs entirely on timing, ruthless coordination, and striking faster than the enemy reacts. Russian forces advanced using weather they thought provided cover, but that exact choice bunched them up for a slaughter. Ukrainian troops exploited that brief window to hammer the column with a highly coordinated, relentless assault. That tactical shift exposed just how rapidly premium military assets become scrap metal once their movement, protection, and unit cohesion break down entirely. The ultimate tactical takeaway is not just about cost differences between these weapons. It shows exactly how agile tactics and lethal precision completely wreck old-school assumptions about brute force. In a brutal fight like this, survival does not rely on armor alone, but on how fast a unit reacts after getting spotted. You and I are watching the very nature of combat evolve, but we can never forget the absolute human cost behind these shifting tactics. Breaking down these intense frontline engagements is never about glorifying the violence. It is about facing the harsh risks, battlefield decisions, and fatal consequences driving today's headlines. Stay locked on Military Force for hard-hitting analysis straight from the front lines, because grasping the brutal reality of modern war reminds us why peace actually matters.